Most people think of sleepwalking as harmless, wandering the house, mumbling nonsense, maybe even raiding the fridge. But what if sleepwalking wasn't just an unconscious habit? What if something else took control? What if you woke up in places you shouldn't be? Or worse? What if your reflection moved before you did? Tonight we dive into 6 terrifying true stories of sleepwalking nightmares, where the scariest part isn't what they did while asleep, but what was watching them. Story 1. The Edge of the Roof. Daniel had always been a sleepwalker, but it was never anything serious until that night. His wife, Claire, woke up to an empty bed, the cold sheets beside her sending an immediate wave of unease through her. She sat up, scanning the dark bedroom. "Daniel?" she whispered, expecting him to be in the bathroom or maybe in the kitchen for a midnight snack. Then she heard it, a faint shuffling noise from outside. Heart pounding, she hurried to the window. The sight made her blood run cold. Daniel was standing on the edge of their 2-story house's roof, swaying slightly. His eyes were open, but unfocused, and his lips moved as if he were whispering to someone. Claire's breath hitched. "Daniel!" she screamed. He didn't react. Instead, he took another step toward the ledge, his bare feet barely gripping the shingles. Panicked, Claire bolted down the stairs and out the front door. She craned her neck up at her husband, who now stood with his toes hanging off the edge. "Daniel, wake up, please!" Daniel suddenly stiffened as if hearing her. His head turned toward her, but something was wrong. His eyes were too wide, his mouth slightly open in what looked like a grin. Then he leaned forward. Claire let out a piercing scream. At the last second, Daniel's body jerked as if something invisible had yanked him backward. He collapsed onto the roof, gasping, his body shaking violently. A few moments later, he woke up, confused and terrified. "Claire, what happened?" She didn't answer. She was too busy staring at their roof, where for just a split second, she swore she saw something else standing behind him. Story 2. The Silent Shadow. Lisa wasn't a heavy sleeper, but that night, exhaustion had dragged her under. A sudden shift in the air woke her, an overwhelming sense of something watching her. Blinking the sleep from her eyes, she turned over, expecting to see the dim glow of the hallway light. Instead, she found herself staring into wide, glassy eyes. Rebecca was standing over her bed. Lisa's breath hitched. Rebecca's face was blank, her pupils dilated so large that they almost consumed the whites of her eyes. Her lips were slightly parted and her chest rose and fell in slow, unnatural movements. Lisa swallowed. "Rebecca?" she whispered. No response. Her roommate just stood there staring down at her. Lisa sat up slowly, dread settling into her stomach. "Rebecca, you're sleepwalking. Let's..." Before she could finish, Rebecca moved. Not a step, not a normal motion. Her body collapsed onto Lisa, her hands wrapping around Lisa's throat. Lisa choked out a scream, thrashing beneath her friend's grip. Rebecca's expression didn't change. Her eyes still blank, her mouth slightly open, but her fingers tightened. Lisa clawed at Rebecca's hands, her vision going blurry. She gasped, her strength fading. Then Rebecca let out a sharp gasp and collapsed backward. Lisa scrambled away, coughing and shaking. Rebecca groaned, pressing a hand to her head. What's going on?" she mumbled, confused. Lisa just stared, unable to speak. Because in the dim moonlight, she saw Rebecca's fingernails were covered in dirt, as if she had been digging into something before she came into the room. Story 3. The Sleepwalking Escape. The Harris family was a picture of normality until the night their son vanished. When Mrs. Harris woke up at 3 a.m., she had no reason to check on her 8-year-old son, Jake. It was only when she went to the bathroom that she noticed something odd. The front door was wide open. Her heart stopped. Shaking, she sprinted to Jake's room, only to find the bed empty. "Jake!" she screamed, waking her husband in an instant. The police were called, and neighbors gathered, their flashlights combing through the suburban streets. Panic grew with each passing second. Then, just as dawn was breaking, they found him. Jake was sitting alone on a park bench, half a mile from home, his small bare feet covered in dirt. He was staring at the sky, completely unbothered by the freezing air. His parents rushed to him. "Jake, what happened? Are you okay?" Jake blinked up at them, confused. "I just followed the man," he said simply. Mrs. Harris felt a chill run through her. "What man?" Jake frowned, his little brows knitting together. "The one that knocked on my window." There was no one on their security footage, no signs of forced entry, just Jake, sleepwalking out of the house, pausing every few minutes as if listening to something. Story 4. The Shadow in the Mirror. Ethan had always been a sleepwalker, but he never thought much of it. He'd wake up in strange places, on the couch, in the bathtub once, but it was harmless, just a weird quirk. Lately, though, things had changed. His apartment felt off. It started with minor things, his closet door being open when he knew he had shut it, or waking up to find his shoes neatly lined up when he always left them scattered. Then he started having nightmares, vague and blurry, of someone standing over his bed. One night, fed up, he decided to record himself. He propped his phone on his nightstand, set it to record, and went to sleep. The next morning, he almost didn't check the footage. But curiosity got the better of him. He scrolled through the video, watching himself toss and turn. Then, at exactly 2:47 a.m., he sat up. His posture was stiff, unnatural. His head tilted at an odd angle, his lips moving though no sound came out. Then he stood and walked out of frame, toward the bathroom. The camera didn't pick up what happened inside, but it showed him coming back out and staring directly into the lens. Ethan felt his stomach tighten. His face was blank, but his eyes were too wide. And then he smiled, a slow, creeping grin that didn't belong to him. Shaken, Ethan rewound the video, pausing when he saw something that nearly made his heart stop. His reflection in the bathroom mirror did not move at the same time as him. It was a split-second delay, but it was there. His real body moved, and then the reflection copied him. A chill ran down his spine. That wasn't him in the mirror. Ethan slammed his laptop shut, his hands shaking. He didn't sleep in his apartment that night, or ever again. Story 5. The Locked Door. Maria's parents had dealt with her sleepwalking since she was a child, but nothing prepared them for what happened that night. At exactly 2 a.m., Mrs. Diaz woke to the sound of banging. She nudged her husband. "Did you hear that?" The banging grew louder. They rushed downstairs, their hearts pounding. The front door was rattling violently, the chain lock straining against the force. Maria stood there, her small hands wrapped around the doorknob, twisting, shaking, trying to get out. "Maria!" her mother gasped, running to her. Maria stopped. Slowly she turned to face them, her movements jerky, unnatural. Her lips parted slightly. "She's in my room." A cold sweat broke out on Mrs. Diaz's skin. "Who, sweetie?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Maria's breath came out ragged, her head tilting ever so slightly to the side. "The girl in the closet." Mrs. Diaz went rigid. Her husband stepped forward. "Maria, let's go back to bed, okay?" He gently touched her shoulder, guiding her away from the door. Maria let out a small, dazed sigh before mumbling, "She told me to let her in." The words sent an icy shiver down her mother's spine. The next morning, Maria had no memory of the incident. Her parents didn't want to scare her, but they needed to know what was happening. They set up a motion-activated camera in her room. The following night, at 1:59 a.m., the camera captured Maria sitting up in bed, but she wasn't looking at the door. She was staring straight at the closet. Then, she smiled. Story 6. The Midnight Feast. Greg lived alone in a quiet farmhouse. He wasn't the type to believe in the supernatural, but lately, something wasn't right. Every morning, his kitchen was a mess. Crumbs on the floor, his fridge left open, food missing. At first, he thought he had rodents, but nothing else was disturbed. Then, one night, he woke up with the taste of raw meat in his mouth. Horrified, he rushed to the sink, spitting into the drain. He barely ate meat, let alone uncooked meat. That was when he decided to record himself. The next morning, he watched the footage. At 2:30 a.m., his body sat up with an unnatural slowness, his head tilted back as if his limbs were being pulled by invisible strings. Then, with stiff, jerky movements, he walked to the kitchen. Greg watched in growing horror as his sleeping self opened the fridge, grabbed a raw steak, and bit into it. Not just a nibble. He ripped it apart with his teeth, chewing hungrily. Then, mid-bite, he looked directly at the camera. Greg felt sick. The version of himself on screen chewed slowly, his lips stretching into a wide, unnatural grin. His mouth moved, forming words. Greg turned the volume up. "Not hungry yet." His breath caught in his throat. Then, his sleepwalking self tilted his head all the way back, farther than a human neck should bend. Greg shut off the video. He didn't sleep for days after that, but then it got worse. One morning, he woke up in bed feeling sluggish. His stomach felt full. Dreading what he'd find, he forced himself to the kitchen. The fridge was open. The counters were covered in blood-stained plastic wrappers. And in the sink was an uncooked, half-eaten steak. His hands started to tremble. Then he noticed something else. His fingers were covered in dried blood, but he wasn't cut. Greg moved out a week later. But no matter where he went, some nights, he still woke up with the taste of raw meat on his tongue. Sleepwalking is often dismissed as just another sleep disorder. Harmless, routine, maybe even funny. But these stories remind us that the mind is at its most vulnerable when the body moves without it. Were these just cases of extreme sleepwalking? Or was something guiding them? Perhaps the scariest question of all is this: what if one night you wake up somewhere unexpected and realize you weren't alone? Sleep well, if you can.